Hi, folks. Welcome to the Ask the Arb podcast, where today we have got Sean Tofts with us. So Sean is the founder of Elite Planning, which is a boutique consultancy that works with prime land and development on residential land and mixed-use projects. His background includes delivering multiple development sites across England with a focus on balancing housing delivery and sustainability. I can see you wrote this, Sean. The reason I've invited Sean on today is that Sean is the founder of the Small Sites Alliance, which was inspired by Sean's experiences with BNG, which is how we stumbled across one another. So the Small Sites Alliance sort of advocates for small-scale developers, ensuring their voices are heard in planning policy debate. So Sean, welcome. Thanks for agreeing to do this. I like to put people outside of their comfort zone, and so welcome on.
Thank you for having me. That's a great introduction. I know, obviously, you did ask me, could you tell me what sort of things should you say? And it's a bit of a back and forth, isn't it, really? I tried to keep it sort of as short as possible. But I'm really glad to be here, and thank you for having me.
Pleasure. So, Sean, I guess let's start right at the very beginning, really. So, for the uninitiated, how on earth did you end up in this space? What's your background? Take us right back to the start, if you can remember back that far.
Yeah, I can do. So I won't go too much detail about some bits. So I started off studying architecture, and then essentially I moved into town planning. And then I did a degree in urban design. So I've always sort of been in the built environment space. But I actually was involved with BNG in a very sort of at the sidelines sort of space when I was working at a borough council, and they announced the BNG policy. So I think that would have been around 10 years ago. And we were all sort of called up to London to go and see what Natural England, DEFRA were doing with it. And to be honest, I think the concerns that I've got now are that many of the issues we raised at the time are still what we're seeing today, and the questions aren't really being answered. So 10 years on, I'll try and be as positive as possible, but I am seeing a lot. I think sometimes people are a bit sycophantic about some of the departments. Obviously, they've got links with them and stuff, and we need to be positive where possible. But people are saying, it's teething issues here, there, and everywhere. But it is 10 years on. This isn't teething issues at this point. We've had 10 years of policy formation, implementation. So I think, the main issue, as you said, we sort of met because I was doing some BNG work, and essentially I was finding that it's incredibly hard to try and get BNG to work on some small sites. And that's why, obviously, as well, through Elite Planning, I work with a lot of small developers on small sites mainly, so minor applications, 10 dwellings and under. And there's a variation on if you can get BNG on those sites as well. But essentially, I was finding it's becoming sort of untenable for developers, particularly when you look at sort of a perfect storm that's going on now with stamp duty at 5% as well, which, it doesn't affect everyone, but for certain very small developers, that and then BNG as well, it can be really problematic. There's a lot of issues to go into, really, to be honest, but essentially BNG was why I set up the Small Sites Alliance. So there was other things going on in the background, but it was one policy where I felt that no one was really sort of advocating for small sites and small developers specifically. So that's where there was sort of a gap in advocacy, and that's why I've set it up.
And thanks for that. That's really, really useful background. I mean, it's been clear since day one when we started working with you that you obviously had immense frustrations around the planning system, but specifically BNG. So from your perspective and where you're sitting, because I mean, Rover, a bit like some of the other consultancies that you work with, work right across the UK. So we have experience of lots of different local authorities, and that tends to formulate my opinions on these things. And I've been quite vocal about what I feel about BNG and how that applies to small sites. But I mean, can you expand on the hurdles that small developers are facing at the moment since this policy's come in?
Yeah, sure. So I think just talk about what you were saying then, though, first, in terms of the variation in geographical locations, and it can even be sometimes to a case officer sort of comparison. Even though everything, so the metric, obviously, the whole idea, I don't know how much your listeners will know about BNG from the outset, but obviously it's about, it's enshrined in the Environment Act 2021, I think. It's about leaving the environment in. You've got a 10% net gain of B&G after you've done a development. So it was all about doing a metric, simplifying things. Everyone knows that we're playing from the same. Well, not playing from the same hymn. I think I'm getting to different analogies mixed up there, but everyone's playing from the same book essentially. So that was what the plan was, and in reality, there is inconsistencies in terms of how the policy is applied. It's a really complex thing, as you'll know. But B&G is a simplified version to a certain extent of biodiversity, but it doesn't take into account many different factors. So let's look at the small sites metric for a start. So that was sort of tacked on at the end, is how I'd probably put it. It's not necessarily how the government departments would suggest it was. They said that small sites were always taken into account, but my understanding from people who have worked at MHCLG, DEFRA and Natural England is it was a sort of last minute, we'll get this to work for that, because at the end of the day, the larger developers, sort of the big six, were the main people who were being consulted and listened to when it came to B&G. And you can see, I don't know what your view would be, but on larger sites of, say, 100 homes, 500 homes, there is adequate space to do an on-site B&G.
Totally agree. Yeah.
And even, to be honest, on small sites, it depends on the size of the site, right? So if you're doing 10 homes, which I've got a scheme for 10 homes at the moment, there's no problems with doing B&G. It depends, obviously, on the context. So if you're doing 10 flats in London, a bit different. But if you're doing 10 bungalows in rural Essex, you will probably have space to do some B&G. If you're doing just one infill home or two infill homes, there isn't any space which will be outside of the private curtilage to be able to do B&G net gain. Obviously there is some net gain that can be done with private gardens and stuff, but at the same time it's not at the level that would be required to meet the standard. The small sites metric, I don't really know where to start with that. Well, I will say one of the other consultancies I've spoken to, out of all of the applications I've done, and it's thousands since small sites metric came in and with B&G came in, they used it about 7 times. So it's different.
I know who you're talking about, and that sort of that mirrors our experience. So if we have a customer that comes to us at the moment and asks for the small site metric, or the local authority have asked him for the small site metric, we steer them away from it. Because it's overly cautious and it just creates problems. So my senior ecologist and the ecologists that we've got working in that space now, and like all ecological consultancies, we've upskilled massively. I think even since we first started working with you, we've upskilled and changed things enormously to make sure that we deliver exactly what's needed. There's huge variability between local planning authorities, and I don't think any ecologist got into this game to fight over 3 square meters of wildflower meadow behind a lidl. 100%. It's just absolutely ridiculous. But the small sites metric, my sales team in particular try and steer people away from that and just say, look, actually if we would always rather go to the site for a start, because that just removes a barrier that we're going to come up against later on when the local authority ecologist gets at it. So we would far more. I'm mixing my words. It's because I've been training all morning, so I've been talking at somebody for 2 hours.
Might be infectious from me as well. I'm sorry.
I'm going to blame you. But we would much rather use the statutory metric, because we know exactly where we're sitting with that. So that doesn't surprise me that they're experiencing that as well. Have you had much pushback on schemes when you've used that metric, the small sites metric?
I haven't used it, to be honest, because it just so. In theory, the whole idea was that a competent person could use it, right? So there's no description as to who a competent person is, but I'm going to assume the basics of it is it's someone who's had time to read 58 pages of a PDF. And now if we're looking at professionals working in the built environment, it would always make sense just to get an ecologist to do it, because if you're going to pay for an architect, I would say if it's a small scheme, it might be the architect's going to have a look at it. They're going to need to do that. They're going to have some sort of basic understanding of different bits, and it won't pick up. So on one of the schemes which you're working with me actually on at the moment, I won't go into the details of the scheme, but essentially when you do the PEA, it brings up things that an architect might not notice. So specialist or protected species,
Yeah.
So
Priority
it's
habitats.
a bit problematic. And technically, the LPA is meant to just take the small sites metric done by a competent person and not even review it. Now, I would say that would be really foolish in a lot of senses. If we actually do want to ensure there's biodiversity net gain, then you're just taking the word of someone who is a self-proclaimed competent person, and I just don't, it's just not realistic really. So I think the small sites metric is very limited in terms of how useful it is, and I just don't know really. I think one of the issues that comes up as well is that the way that, again, looking at larger sites, the way they work quite often is under option agreement, for example, would be a good example. They might have an option agreement for 5-10 years. You've got time to front load all this stuff. You've got the funding because the investment for, one of the large companies is good. Like, they've got that there. But in terms of small developers, so a lot of my clients, they are, I think speculative is always seen as an emotive, knee-jerk, dirty word, but if it's a speculative development within the development boundary, that's also a windfall development. That's the sort of thing that we really need to start to churn out, really, to be honest. And that might be where they are competing. We've got several properties at the moment that are working on that basis, actually. They're competing with owner-occupiers on a property which has got a very large plot, and we need to move fast, so it would be a case of potentially getting a pre-app in, hopefully, and then securing the property, and then bidding on that basis. That could be, if you're trying to compete with someone who is an owner-occupier, that could be, you're needing to get everything done within 3 months, maybe 6 months. And if you're looking at doing B&G with ecology not on the small sites metric, which as I said everyone's doing, you need to get a PEA done, then you need to get B&G done. It's a lot of stuff that needs to be front loaded as opposed to how things used to work, which, I've got a scheme. I've been asked a lot of times, can you show us an example? Well, actually, I've got a scheme which is up for sale now. This is an advert for that, by the way. I've got a scheme which is up for sale now.
If anybody's looking for a site.
If anyone's looking for a site in Buckinghamshire.
No, not Buckinghamshire.
No,
anyway, I'm not going to say a word more about Buckinghamshire.
Well, the good thing is, this one's got planning approved. So
right, okay.
It's a rarity. But,
Snap it up, people. Snap it up, and I shall say no more.
It probably wouldn't have been approved with the BNG as it is now, and it wouldn't have been as viable. So there was a tree on site that had to be removed. It wasn't TPO'd. And I know there's always an emotive element to that as well. You deal with arboriculture a lot. People don't like to see trees removed, but on balance, is supplying 2 new homes and removing 1 tree when there's lots of trees around, and then planting 5 or 6 afterwards anyway, is that a good balance? But if we were to remove that tree now, with the B&G metric, it would be, I don't know, it could be tens of thousands of pounds to meet that metric requirement.
And you've hit on something there, probably inadvertently, in that if a developer, particularly a small scale developer, has got a lot of land banked on the basis that those schemes were developable 3 or 4 years ago, they may not be now. They're not viable. And we certainly experience a lot of people that aren't as clued up as you and aren't as experienced as you in this space that come to us, and they're like, they just say to us, the local authority need a B&G assessment. I just need a B&G assessment, and they think it's a box tick. And when you look at it, and like you say, it's a small plot, or it's an infill development, back garden development, whatever it might be, and they have to remove 1 or 2 trees that actually, in the grand scheme of things, might not be particularly high quality. And they might not even have particularly high biodiversity value, depending on numerous different factors. But like you say, the way that's accounted for now in the metric, and I know my senior ARB consultant Peter's doing a lot of work on this at the moment. Yeah, it makes the site totally unviable. And we've had people in tears on the phone who have had to go. The planning's lapsed. They've had to go back to planning, and then they're asked for B&G, and it's just scuppered the scheme.
Yeah. I think one small tip I would say, actually, if anyone is looking at speculative developments, is to check the 2020 satellite images as well, because if any trees have been removed since then, that will be taken into account in the B&G. So don't be going by, you're buying what you're seeing, you're buying what was on the site in 2020. That's a note I'm going to take for myself, actually. The other thing I would say, though, is obviously you've just discussed the trees might not be of high biodiversity value, and hands up, I know there's a long list of things I do at the start of this, but I'm not an ecologist, as you know, but not all trees are equal in terms of biodiversity, are they? And there's not enough distinction, I would say, within that. So, you know, if it's a large conifer, or it could even be, I don't know, a laurel or something potentially, that's not going to necessarily have the same biodiversity impact as something which is native in the area. I know there's a small amount of differentiation, but the point I'm trying to make is I think in some senses it really dumbs down ecology to me, to be honest. It makes it all a tick box, and that's not really what it should be.
Yeah, it does. And there are also issues, and I'm not 100% clued up on it. So please don't anybody listening take this as gospel. But there's starting to be real issues around the veteran tree definition as well within BNG, because the Ancient Tree Forum and the Arboricultural Association have very different definitions of what a veteran tree is to what has been used within the metric. So that's going to create all sorts of issues as well.
I mean, you touch on another semi-ironic point, really, to be honest, that you know, veteran trees get a lot of value, but when we look at this, so it just sounds mad if you say this. I hope someone's listening to this and they've never heard anything about BNG before, because it's taken 15 years. Yeah, probably have, but it's taken 15 years to get to this point, and I don't know how many millions of pounds, and then the net gain is secured for 30 years. It could be longer, but in the minimum standard it is 30 years. So, I mean, we're giving a lot of weight to veteran trees, so we understand the logic that biodiversity gains through time. It doesn't work on a 30-year cycle and then it's diminishing returns. I think it was apparently to do with the Green Book financial model. Again, I'm not all that aware of what that involves, but essentially they use financial models to base what the 30 years should be. That was seen as a realistic time frame, but it's not a net gain in perpetuity. It's not one for a lifetime. It's barely a generation, and half the amount of time it's taken to get to here. So what I have an issue with that is that I find that just to be clear as well, I do think there are some solutions that I'll maybe mention a little bit further on, but it's quite condescending in terms of the way that we deal with homeowners. So it's kind of just, I think they just obviously, everyone's just going to put down astroturf and plastic plants and there won't be any biodiversity. But actually, if you look at gardens, some people do that, you know, and whether that's right or wrong, that's not really for me to decide. But a lot of gardens over years do mature and they do become quite biodiverse. And in reality, if you had a farmer who's going to do a meadow for 30 years, after that time, there's no structures in place at the moment. Unless they're going to do it out of the goodness of their heart, they're probably going to return that back to a use which is going to be financially viable for them, to be honest. Whereas a garden, you know, the longer you put in a tree, the more it offers you essentially in lots of respects. And even if you had, I think I worked out that if this was before BNG as well, if half the 300,000 homes we were meant to be building at the time were houses, right? So assume half of flats, that's nowhere near it, but like quite conservatively, half of houses with a 50 square metre rear garden, you had hedging to the back and to one side, you'd be planting 4,000 miles of hedging a year, I think it was that I worked out. So, and again, imagine, you know, even only half the people decide to keep that hedging over, because it could be protected with a landscaping condition for 5 years anyway, or even better, we could change the way that we do development in this country. We could say, actually, no, we're not going to make BNG have to go off-site, but we're going to make it so that you do need to do some more on-site, and you could change the way that landscaping conditions work so that, very much like if you do a housing extension, there'll be some permitted development rights, but trees could be BNG TPOs, so specific trees.
Yes.
There's lots of different ways you could do with it, but
I mean, one of my major issues with all of this is that actually I know that BNG is heavily weighted to on-site enhancements, and on the face of it, that seems like a good idea, but in the vast majority of cases, it's not a good idea because there's no connectivity to the wider environment. We've dealt with sites that have been, you know, in the centre of cities, and there is no connectivity. So if you're just putting, I don't know, a little bit of shrubbery in and maybe a green wall, perhaps a green roof, you can argue till the cows come home that there is biodiversity value to that. But to my mind, if that's not connected to the wider environment, it's a waste of time. My personal view is, and I'm quite vocal about this, is that I think there should be a proportional financial contribution to a nature restoration fund of some sort, and then
Right.
use that money where it counts to do the best work. And all these little do what we can with the existing legislation to preserve what's there. Absolutely, we absolutely should do that. But creating very small pockets of habitat in quite often an urban environment just doesn't really stack up for me, because I'm nearly 50, so I've seen various different sways of this come over the years, and I've been involved in schemes within cities all over the UK. And the big one is always tree planting. You know, there's organisations like Trees for Life, etc., that
Right,
say
yeah.
they're planting 400,000 trees a year across the UK. And when you look at it, they're all whips. They're all
Right.
planted in grass next to a school somewhere. They get strimmed by the grounds maintenance contractors. They don't last 5 years, let alone 50 years.
Yeah, yeah.
So, you know, I guess there's a little bit of cynicism sneaking in there from me, but I think there is very large, when we're talking about small sites, let me be clear, we're talking about small sites here. I think there's real issues with BNG. I think just
Yeah.
ask for a financial contribution, a bit like they do with SILS payments and all that kind of good stuff, and let's divert that money to where it's actually needed. So,
Well, I mean, so for very small sites, generally it will be an off-site payment anyway, and obviously, as you know, there's a multiplier effect when it's off-site because it's meant to be punitive. So essentially, we're putting punitive actions in place against SMEs, and particularly the S side of the SME. So I'll probably go back into the Small Sites Alliance again just a bit now. So there are organisations that do advocacy work for SMEs. So you know, there's the House Building Federation, for example, and there's numerous other ones. But one of the issues that I found is that S could be, you know, one family company, which is one person on their own, delivering one house over 2 years. M can be 1,000 units a year. So the difference in between the two is huge. And you can imagine with who's vocal within those groups, who's got more influence, it's never going to be the case. It's such a broad church that they're never going to say anything which is going to compromise the space for 1,000 units a year versus the smaller companies, to be honest. So essentially what I'm trying to say is that we're trying to do more generally. So B&G is a big one at the moment, but more to advocate for better market circumstances, basically, for small developers. And I think we need to encourage more people to get involved in development as well. So you'll probably be aware that, you know, there's loads of investors in property in the UK, but a lot of them won't touch new build, for example.
Yeah.
There's a lot of steps we could do to try and encourage that, and I think we're going to need to if we want to deliver the level of homes that we're requiring every year. I think one sort of shocking stat is that in the 1980s, I think it was 39% of our homes were delivered by SMEs, so that was obviously small to medium size, and now it's around 12%, and I can see that diminishing year on year at the moment, particularly with how things are going. So if we want to get the homes that we need built, we want the homes to be of the quality that people want as well. I'm not going to knock the large developers, you know, they all have their places, but you can get much more bespoke schemes when you're looking at small sites, and they will generally as well. If we take a step back again and look at the larger picture, and we're talking about B&G in terms of the grand scheme of things, obviously doing infill development is sustainable. That is a more useful way of doing development, making sure that homes are in, I'm not saying everything should be super dense, but trying to make the best use of the land that we're already using for development. And I guess just going back to your point on green roofs and green walls, unfortunately they don't really add into the metric anyway. I think on one scheme that I'm working with you actually, we put a little green roof on it, and it was like, we'll just take it off. It's not adding anything to the metric, so it's not really encouraging it. And though I agree with you, you know, that if we look at it at sort of the nature recovery level, you need to have strategic biodiversity corridors and stuff. One of the aims of the Environment Act was to bring people closer to nature. Now on small sites, I've just been in a business meeting with investors this morning. We will probably have to pay for off-site gains. Now, for me to try and explain to them, on top of that, could we also put in some hedging stuff? We've already paid for it to be off-site, so, and there is only a limited amount of funds. This will go to the point at some point where reality, I mean, this is the reality of it, that you don't need to have any specific numbers. There is only a certain amount of money that can be gifted to different things when you're doing a development. Affordable housing will be something that will potentially be limited by the B&G regime as it is at the moment.
You know, we're marching towards, and I know you haven't a chance to look at it properly, the working paper that came out just before Christmas, but we are marching towards a pay-per-play development model in the UK now. And you're right, you know, if you've got an investor-backed development, if you're not financing it out of your own pocket, then they're just going to look at the cold hard numbers on that, and they go, well, okay, well, if I can pay a fee and make Great Christian Newts go away, if I can pay a fee and make Bats go away, if I can pay a fee and make BNG go away, that will just get considered within the investment decision. And if they can make their margin on that, then off they'll go, and that's what they'll do. So we are sidelining biodiversity and biodiversity enhancements by going down this road. So yeah, it's an interesting one. So thinking of the schemes that you've got going on at the moment, and obviously I don't want you to name anyone or any particular specifics, but what are your key issues in your day-to-day job with biodiversity net gain at the moment? Is it just that it can't be met on site?
That's one issue. Another issue is time for so MHCLG's published their own report recently as well, I am doing a response to the consultation we talk about for the Small Sites Alliance. I just want to get very polished before I send it out. So one of the issues is, though, that there isn't enough resources within local authorities to deal with it. And actually, I haven't done the exact numbers yet, but if we're to deliver the level of homes needed each year, I think it's a mathematical impossibility, to be completely honest, that there is enough ecologists in the country to be able to do all of the other things ecology do, but also PEAs and BNG metrics. We're not delivering half the amount of homes at the moment, and you'll know, I'll be candid about it, you know, I'm working with yourself and other ecology companies because there's just not enough resource out there, really. So if you can get an ecologist, hold on to them, by the way. Send them cake and stuff, because it's really difficult at the moment. And BNG within councils as well, some of them have their own ecologists, a lot of them have them at the county level. A lot of the people dealing with it are very junior, are being sort of thrown in at the deep end because there's not enough people. So it's really stalling development.
I don't know if you listened to the last podcast I did with Ian. He is ex-local authority planning officer, and he has some interesting insights into this. And one of the things that came out of it was just, you know, the major revenue generating department in all local authorities is the planning department, and all that money gets siphoned out elsewhere. None 100%. Of it gets kept within the planning department. They're using absolute archaic systems for managing their workload. Their workload is pretty much managed directly through their inbox. And I know, and we're a very heavily tech driven company, and we've got a lot of systems and processes in place, and we're struggling. So I can only imagine what it must be like. If you're working in a local authority at the moment, then you have my sympathy. I might throw mud every now and again, but at a human level, I just can't. It must be an untenable place to work.
I think particularly planning is really difficult, and also when I said 100%, I didn't mean 100% of the money gets sucked off, but it is true that a lot of money does, in many councils, get moved into different areas. Even when it's ring fenced, which it very often isn't anyway, it will be spent on something like an IT system, which is for the whole council. So it quite often, you have got to balance that though with a lot of councils aren't making plans, but if they are proactively making local plans, that does cost money as well. But a lot of money does get taken away from it. They are massively under-resourced. It's a really difficult one with planning, really, to be honest, because planners are being asked to do more and more and more, and there's more specialisms. So how do you get people to get involved in it? I mean, I really do encourage people to get involved in planning, but it's a very complex role now. It's not like back in the day, I don't think, where, you know, just glass of whiskey, have a look at it on a piece of tracing paper, oh yeah, that field will be allocated. And it shouldn't be like that either. I'm not saying it should, but we should try and we should be making smart decisions, basically. So, I mean, with the small sites, I have highlighted, and it did get a little bit of traction in one meeting I had with MHCLG, but they were worried about the optics. I'll be honest about it. They said, well, how would that look in terms of the optics? It's like, well, it would look like you're helping small developers and builders. I think we tend to use the word builders because it's emotively a bit better. But the plan that I had was that So the rationale is custom build and self-build homes, you'll be aware, but some of your listeners might not be, are B&G exempt at the moment. And that was pushed for by, I think it's called NASCBA, so it's the National Association of Self-Build and Custom, or something like that.
Something like that, yeah.
So that was that. They're exempt. So if we have a look at that, they're mainly on small sites, right? And essentially, the rationale is that they want to promote people building their own homes and custom build homes. The problem is, so I've had one scheme go through recently, which was custom build, outline custom build, so it now needs to be done on that basis. Some councils, I've heard one council, I don't want to name it, but one council's now not looking at allowing any custom build because they think it's someone circumventing the system. But even if you wanted to, there's a reality check that needs to be in place. So, you know, a lot of the developments I work on, we'd be happy to do them as custom build, but getting the finance for that is much more complicated in certain situations because you can't tell them how much you need to borrow or what the end value will be. So, and in terms of the product as well, it's semi harder to do than sell a product which is this is the house you're going to buy. But the whole rationale anyway is to help those groups. If you look at self-builders, for example, you know, I think it's really good that people are able to build their own homes, but they don't need, it's not business for them, and they don't need to make a profit at the end of the day, whereas small developers, it is their business, and they do need to make a profit, and they need things to be quicker. So my view was that if we've already got this exemption in place for self and custom build, why can't we do it for small sites? It makes sense in terms of allowing them to have the same sort of equity within the system. And the sort of pushback on that was that the legislation made exemptions for them. But I've looked at it, I mean, I'm not a barrister. It's another thing I'm not as well. But I do think there's room within the legislation to move the de minimis up or change the de minimis. So through secondary legislation anyway, you could make it so that you know, schemes of up to 5 homes are exempt, for example. That would be a good starting point. I know the de minimis is 25 square metres at the moment as well, which is probably causing quite a lot of problems for you, is it?
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
That's the short answer.
Because you end up arguing, like, I mean, I could talk about this forever.
I know, that's the problem,
the pushback on, you know, we're working on a scheme and nobody will know what it is or where it is, but it is a large site. It does fall squarely within BNG. They are going to achieve something like a 300% net gain on site fairly easily because it's an old semi-industrial site that's covered in greenhouses, and the only ecological feature of interest on the whole site is a linear feature of native hedging. Great. That's on the site boundary. It's been retained. It's not being touched. There's a wee buffer of grass between that and the new built footprints. Excellent. That's all staying as it is. It can be retained and protected. There's an old building on site with some weatherboarding that has very low bat potential. It's unlikely they're going to be using it because of various other factors. And we thought this was clean cut. It's like, well, great. But the local authority ecologist or one of the bodies that they go out to, whose name shall not be mentioned, I can't remember which in this particular incident, has basically, within our aerial imagery, because most rover jobs we tend to use drones to feed into the process, which is really, really useful for B&G as well, for nadir mapping, having the camera looking directly down, has spotted some very, very light vegetation around the edges of these greenhouses that wasn't mapped in the habitat plan on BNG, and it's like, no, because it's being sprayed off with chemical every 6 weeks. It's being managed. These are weeds. It's not. And it's like, where's the pragmatism in this? For goodness sake, we're achieving
to delivering homes quickly, is it? Let's be
no,
honest.
no, and we're achieving nearly 300% net gain on this site. You know, surely, why are you making work for yourself? Yeah. This is tick done, tick, move on, get on to the next application. But no, we're going to argue over this now.
Well, as I said, I'm going to be releasing, and it'll be under the guise of the Small Sites Alliance, the full report shortly. I've got a briefing report which I think you've seen. There is one thing in that which I need to update because I wasn't sent the information from MHCLG in time, but the economic viability of the the policy as well is really questionable, particularly for small sites.
Yeah.
But one thing I think they really need to do now is, and I've spoken to some MPs, and they seem to be quite keen to sort of get a handle on this. They're seeing that it's an issue, is to put a pause on the metric use for small sites and just go back to how things were, doing biodiversity sort of on a case by case basis, discretionary way that it is with lots of other things in planning. And the other thing with that is it would mean that it can all sort of be, a lot of it could be put on at the end of the planning application instead of front loaded, which is really problematic for small developers in terms of finance and time, as sort of suggested. And one other thing, so this is the bit where optically they were a bit worried, was that if we're delivering about 20% of homes through small sites at the moment and 80% through large sites, why don't we just make large sites deliver 12%, so 2% more over a huge site, and give the exemption to small sites? And they still have to do B&G as it was before, sort of biodiversity net gain, just not by a calculation as such. And that would be better. It would also lead to more development, considering having B&G, because if you think that custom and self-build schemes are generally on smaller sites and they're exempt anyway, we're not even meeting the requirement that we've set out to make. So yeah, that would be the one thing that I think would be quite handy.
There's a huge educational piece around this as well, and you touched on it there. You just made me think that the way this used to be done, most local authorities would require some biodiversity enhancements as part of the scheme, and like you say, discretionary. But they were all the things that we know, native hedgerow planting, native tree planting, invertebrate boxes, bat boxes, all that kind of good stuff. We still now, 2025, have got customers coming to us, quite often architects, with a reasonable size scheme, 3 to 4, maybe 5 units, with fully developed landscape plans going, we're not going to have any issues with B&G, are we? Because we've thought about that and look at what we've done. And quite often it's beautiful. It's wonderfully defensible, the way things used to be done. But then you have to give them the bad news that actually, all of that is within the residential curtilage. Most of it, you might as well just put a big red cross through. That we're going to have to go to site. We're going to have to map. They literally feel that all we need to do is take what's there that they've developed and stick it into the metric, and everything will be rosy. So there's still a huge amount of education to be done around this, and I think that's where the Small Sites Alliance comes in beautifully.
Yeah, hopefully. Thank you. I mean, that's kind of the aim of the game, really. So I'll just, before I go on to talk about that a little bit more, just talk about what you were just saying then as well, though. I was talking to a landscape architect at a council recently, and they don't like, a lot of people working with B&G don't like B&G as well. I think we should just make that quite clear.
Yes.
But the landscape architects said that they're not very keen on it, because now we're seeing B&G dictate what the landscapes look like, as opposed to what is a good landscape, which is obviously got many more functions than delivering habitat for theoretical species who, as you sort of suggested as well, if it's in isolation, it might not even really be helping, to be honest. I mean, the other thing is as well, in terms of what we're doing with development always gets a bad rap. It doesn't. Farmers, quite often, it's an emotive topic, right? It's like support farmers. Developers, no, even though obviously we're delivering homes, they're delivering food. Wild meadows, I think we've seen a 97% decline in them since 1930s. Species, we're seeing rapid decline in the numbers of various species since the 1970s, and 12%, something like that, of England is developed. Now, I don't think all of this is down to, and this comes into the nutrient neutrality thing, right, which the consultation's on. This isn't all to do with housing and people living in housing. This is to do with agricultural practices. And I'm not saying farmers need to pay for all of this, but I think we need to be realistic about what can development pay for, and at least be honest about what is actually causing these issues, because it's certainly not people using bathrooms in houses. The thing is, housing, I mean, arguably you could say, fertility rates and all of that are linked to it, but if someone is in a new build house or in an old house, the nutrient neutrality issue is the same. The only difference is that they're living in a house with new plumbing, which is probably going to be more secure. So I don't really think we should be blaming housing for the nutrient neutrality issue, particularly anyway. And I think we need to get back to seeing housing as a social good as well, to be honest. In terms of the emotive side of things, I think a lot of the queries that we have from people in terms of not liking development as well, I have to say, is quite often to do with the larger developers. People don't like cookie cutter homes. People don't want huge developments all around the place. But if they can see it's local builders employing local people, and there's so many benefits. I mean, they're all on the Small Sites Alliance website. We've got a lot of benefits on there in terms of what small developers do. And just to be clear, at the moment, it's a landing page. But essentially, I've had a lot of people contact me about it. I was trying to work out how to make it work, because I'll be completely honest, it's got to be financially viable. And I was looking at maybe doing a membership scheme, because for me to dedicate enough time to it, I need to make it financially viable. But I did decide at the end of the day that these are all things that I'm really passionate about, and I want them to be sort of put out there to the benefit of all small developers. So I think at the moment we're looking to, if people email in, we're looking to let people join for free, and we'll maybe do some sort of collaborative pieces of work with sponsorship and stuff like that, and hopefully get them some deals as well. So for example, building warranty companies. I don't know about everything in development, that's for sure, and I don't know very many people who do know absolutely everything. But what I like to do with yourself, even for example, right, is get experts who do know about the area, and we try and collaborate and build a better knowledge base around everything. So just as you said with BNG, that's probably the biggest one really for me at the moment when it comes to development. But there are so many areas where we can help upskill developers to know better, because developers quite often as well, they'll get a bad rap and they don't know about this and they don't know that, and there's no one there teaching them about it.
No,
So,
and the way their pipeline works as well. Obviously, our head office is up in Scotland, as I think my listeners know, and luckily we don't have BNG up here yet. But most of our work is in London and the southeast, so it's kind of irrelevant. But where was I going with that? Yes, developers. So we are actually finding that a lot of developers have no in-house knowledge of this and what's coming and how it is going to affect them at the moment, because their development pipeline is so long and they've got so many sites consented. They're not aware, the really large scale house developers, they're just not aware of what's coming down the road for them. And I think that there's a couple up here in Scotland. Actually, we're waiting to see what gets developed in Scotland in terms of biodiversity net gain, because obviously the habitats are different, etc., etc., etc. And I know a few developers that I've worked with personally for over 10 years up here who they just haven't got a clue. And I think they've got lots of sites that actually are going to become undevelopable. Really,
it's really worrying, isn't it? And they only need to have one do go that way, and then they're closed for business. That's another.
And we have this great thing in Britain where we shout and shout and shout. We want this. We want more houses. We need more houses. Oh, but not there and not here, and we can't affect this and we can't affect that, and we just totally and utterly strangle ourselves. And I don't think any of us that work in this space are advocating,
build everywhere.
Build across Greenbelt, but there are so many sites. There are so many sites that could be brought in that are now becoming financially unviable.
When we talk about the Greenbelt, it's probably another good point. So there's the Brownfield Passport consultation, which I think is probably closed now, but I've just written a piece on it actually for Remake Build Britain. It's coming out in February. And essentially, it's looking at what are the questions around brownfield passports at the moment. Obviously, you'll know as well as I do, some brownfield sites, everyone thinks, it's an ex-derelict building and build on it. But quite often, there will be some biodiversity levels there, which they could be. So here at one end, open mosaic, and often it's not actually really open mosaic, but there is biodiversity there. But when you're looking to do, say, a 10% net gain on that, you've also got to take into account decontamination. You've got flood risk quite often, which have to be dealt with, because these quite often, by rivers and stuff, and regardless of if we should be building there or not, there are additional costs that need to be taken into account, including the uplift of the value, because it's got an existing use as well currently. So there's so many different things which hopefully I'll be able to delve into in different pieces on the small sites.
And they don't play well together either.
No, they don't.
So we've got a situation at the moment. The customer has got. I was working on it yesterday personally. Customer's got planning consent for I think it's 3 units on a site, prior to BNG, luckily for them. Otherwise,
Yeah.
the site, they wouldn't have been able to develop it. The tree protection side of things are already in place, so you'll be aware of things like arboricultural method statements and tree protection plans. So all of that has been approved. So we've got tree protection fencing around the site. Excellent. That's all been consented and approved. And we suggested within our construction ecological management plan that the tree protection fencing could also form species protection fencing.
Right.
Because actually, that tree protection fencing has to be on that line. It cannot be moved. So therefore, it forms a really robust, sensible barrier. But no. The local authority have pushed back and said there needs to be 2 separate fences. And you're like, that's not physically possible. I don't know how much time you've spent on construction sites, but that you can't have 2 different fences doing 2 different jobs on almost exactly the same line. It's just, and we stumble across this all the time. All these things are headbutting. So yeah, it's a huge issue. Conscious of time, Sean.
Yeah.
Are you optimistic that these challenges can be overcome?
I'm 100% sure they can be. If they are or not, I'm not 100% sure if they will be. I'm trying my best, and I think one thing I need to make clear is the more people who get involved in this and collaborate, the more we can get a chance to make things change. One top tip I'm going to say, though, just because I feel like I really should do, handy to have it at the end as well, because maybe you can tell them at the start, or there'll be a top tip at the end. If you have got a planning application that has been approved and it's due to run out, and you're going to have to worry about BNG and things like that, make sure you start that build. Like, it doesn't matter if you just as an initial start, it will help you keep it alive, and then you won't need to go back to the drawing board and go, actually, this doesn't work anymore. So it's really important that people, I mean, they can contact me, or they can contact a local planning consultant, and just get some advice on it, really, to be honest.
Well, our top tip always, whenever we start a new relationship with anybody, is get a planning consultant on board early, preferably somebody that's based in the area that you're doing the development. I know that's not always helpful. There are nationwide consultancies, but get a good planning consultant on board, because there are just so many things that could scupper your scheme.
100%.
We had a situation just as you describe about 3 weeks ago. I saw a post on a Facebook group with a chap who was having real trouble with BNG for the exact same reason. He bought a site with planning consent, but it had lapsed about 3 weeks prior.
Right.
They hadn't started on site, and then they had to revisit BNG, and it makes the scheme totally unviable. I think they had to remove a unit from the scheme in the end, which made it break even at best. I'm not even sure it was break even. So
it's very worrying. I mean, I would say if you can go for someone local, that's great. I work nationally, so I work from Manchester, Colchester and Carlisle randomly, so I can cover the whole place, but I would definitely make sure that you check what quality their work is. Try and get some sort of view as to what their decisions they've had come through, because I quite often come in as a bit of a fixer of things, to be honest. People come to me after talking to someone who actually might be cheaper, to be honest, but there's no point of paying less if you've got to revisit it and then
always buy on value.
Buy on value, because also the other thing is, if someone's already messed up the first planning application, the council's already got in their mind they're going to refuse it again, and it makes my job a lot harder.
Yes.
So and unfortunately we'll be paying for that.
100%. Sean, you've been brilliant. I think that's the deepest dive we've had on BNG with small sites on the podcast, and I know it'll be really valuable to people. So in terms of first off, the Small Sites Alliance, how can people find out more about that?
So www.smallsitesalliance.com, that's it.
Awesome.
It's a one-page website. Just put in your email address and stuff at the end, and I'll contact you. Just put in whatever message you want.
Good stuff. And if they're looking for a planning consultant and they want to find Elite Planning?
So they can contact me at info@eliteplanning.co.uk. Small Sites Alliance as well is info@smallsitesalliance.com. And that's it, really. I'm on LinkedIn, so Sean,
perfect.
SEAN, and then Tofts is TOFTS. So feel free.
Excellent. I'll put all the links. I'll put all the links in the show notes anyway. Sean, you've been brilliant. Thanks a lot for coming along, and we'll speak to you soon.
Brilliant. See you later.